Hello, and welcome to this presentation for Pitkin County Senior Services. This presentation is titled Coming to America, Major Religious Traditions in America. In this presentation, which will be much longer than the previous presentations in our series, we will be looking at how many of these religious traditions came to America, the challenges that they faced in coming to America, and then we'll also be looking in the latter half of this presentation at how these traditions have continued to develop and evolve right up to the modern day. This will be a combined lecture presentation between me, Thomas Dezash, and Patrick De Silva, who's been doing some of your other presentations in this series. So we're going to share the conversation throughout this discussion. Patrick will be looking at the Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and I will be looking at Eastern traditions, mainly Hinduism and Buddhism.
In talking about Christianity coming to America, I think the most important issue to address is just the sheer fact of that statement and all that it implies. Because of the outsized role that Christianity has played in our nation's history and in many of our governmental institutions, we sometimes turn a blind eye to the fact that Christianity is not native to these lands. Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion that expands, and especially to Europe, where it takes root in many different forms and is embedded within governmental and certainly imperial institutions that then stretch out across the world, including here to the US. And so just as with all the other traditions that we will be discussing in this rather kind of extended presentation, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, none of these traditions arose here. Instead, people brought them, and these institutions were founded, and we laid down, or people laid down, different roots. Now, in terms of the story of Christianity coming to America, many of us are probably familiar with the story of the Pilgrims who were deemed too extreme, religiously speaking, for 17th century England, and so were sent on their way trying to find a place where they could practice their particular interpretation of the Bible and their denomination of Christianity in or with more freedom. However, if we think, again, historically, we like dates and we like to pay attention to the first time something happens. For many people in the US, we think of Christianity arriving at these shores with the Mayflower in 1620. However, if we broaden our definition of America to include Mexico, which for those of us in Colorado, it wasn't actually that long ago that a big chunk of Colorado belonged to Mexico, so I think this is rather natural for us, then really we need to go back about 90 years before the Pilgrims land at Plymouth Rock. We need to go to a hillside near Mexico City, a hillside known as Tepeyac, where the Virgin Mary, appearing to an indigenous man named Juan Diego, asks that a church should be built in her name on the hill that had previously been associated with the Aztec goddess Tonantzin. Juan Diego relates his story to the bishop, who in turn tells Juan Diego that the Virgin must produce a miracle to verify the story. Juan Diego returns to the Virgin, tradition tells us, and the Virgin tells Juan Diego, "Go and gather these roses at the top of the hill, remember this is happening in December, and then helps him arrange them in Juan Diego's cloak. He carries all of the roses inside of his cloak back to Mexico City. He arrives on the 12th of December. He opens the cloak in front of the bishop, and there is an impression on the cloak of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And that's this miracle. And the cloak is still on display at the Basilica de Guadalupe. It's one of the most visited shrines in the world. And there is precedent for this type of miracle within Christian sort of history. Namely the Shroud of Turin, right? It's a very similar, an impression made of a holy person. Actually, if you want a good book on the Shroud of Turin, my high school history teacher, Bernard Ruffin, wrote one. Maybe I'll list that in the further reading section. But at any rate, I want to mention the Virgin of Guadalupe because, if you're not familiar with Mexican culture, Mexican American culture, then maybe you don't know how ubiquitous she is in artwork, tattoos, murals. Her image is really everywhere. It really is ubiquitous, and I think that has largely to do with her status as this patron saint of Mexico, that when she, as tradition holds, when she appeared to Juan Diego, that she appeared to an indigenous person, you'll notice in this stained glass that her skin is darker. Her skin is the same color as Juan Diego, so she appears as one of them. This is key. She speaks to him in his own language, in Nahuatl. Not in the language of the colonizer, right, of the Spanish. And so she's a critical figure, and I think symbolically for us thinking about Christianity arriving in the Americas, I think really is central to the story. And again, 90 years before these pilgrims show up. As we move on, looking further at sort of history of Christianity coming to America, I think it's important to look at these early colonies and note that they were actually quite diverse, religiously speaking. I mean, with an emphasis here on Christian diversity. So Maryland, or we could think of it also as Maryland, established in 1632, is Roman Catholic. William Penn, Pennsylvania, it's a Quaker colony. The New England colonies follow various congregational models. This is an important part, that there were multiple communities that were practicing here, that were trying to find sort of a space of their own and had various degrees of connection back to England or back to Western Europe. If we move forward a century, which is sort of what we have to do even in a presentation of this length, I think it's important to talk about the Great Awakenings. So in the 1730s and 1740s, we had this first Great Awakening, a period where preachers like Jonathan Edwards, who's featured here in this sort of center column, traveled widely, attracting huge crowds with the message of justification by faith alone, and really in a return to Calvinism. One of Edwards' key sermons in 1741, titled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That's what's depicted here. It's an image of him presiding over the masses. This period is sometimes seen as a reaction against the Enlightenment in Europe, with its emphasis on the rational sciences. So the Great Awakening was a way of awakening this sort of powerful fervency of worship. And again, here we're talking about these different Protestant denominations. In the Second Great Awakening, which is more like the end of the 1700s, I think usually dated roughly 1795 to 1835, this spawned many different evangelical colleges and mission societies, saw large increases in Methodist and Baptist denominations. Also, if we're talking, you're moving into the 19th century, we see the development of several new denominations. And I think especially for us here in Colorado and being part of the Intermountain West, the single most important of those new denominations is started by Joseph Smith, known today as the Jesus Christ Church of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as Mormons. So Smith, living in upstate New York, has this vision in which he receives these golden tablets that would eventually be translated as the Book of Mormon, and spawns this whole community that is quite viciously persecuted. They have practices that aren't typical for that period, especially people focus on polygamy as one practice. Smith himself is killed as the community is migrating west, and as we know, they eventually settle in what's now Utah, centered around the Great Salt Lake. But this is a period, in the 19th century in which Christianity begins to really, I'd say, fracture. We have all these different denominations that start to challenge our definition of what Christianity is. And even today, when I teach my world religions courses, and I do this exercise where people have to go around the room and we just name as many denominations of Christianity as possible. And there's always someone who says, "Oh, wait, are Mormons Christian?" And that question in and of itself, right, speaks to this ambiguity that's there. I also have, of course, students who are Protestant, especially if they're evangelical, and are wondering if Catholics count as Christian. So that again is a way of drawing lines and boundaries that I think is reflective of tension we find within Christianity from a very, very, very early period, but certainly we see it showing up here in the Americas. Now, of course, we have Jewish communities that establish themselves in America and in what's now the U.S. from early on. These are just a few examples. So we have the Touro Synagogue, is one example, established in Newport, Rhode Island, dedicated in 1763. And so this is the synagogue that we're talking about. So the Touro Synagogue is founded, as well as this other one, Shearith Israel, which was founded in New York City in 1654. Both of these synagogues are founded by Sephardic communities, so with roots in Spain and Portugal. And in the case of the Shearith Israel community, I found notes saying it was founded, as I said, in 1654 by this group of Jews who were primarily from Recife, Brazil. And so, and also important to note that the governor of New Amsterdam, as it was known back then, did not want Jews to settle in his area, but they won the right to stay in 1655. Today, I think it's fair to say that Ashkenazi Judaism tends to dominate when we talk about Judaism in America because of the larger numbers of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe and Russia who came to the U.S. more during like the 19th century. But here we have these earliest sort of synagogues, and you can see some of the architecture, what they looked like. This is like, here, let me, this is a map from Shearith Israel, from that community where the synagogue is located. This is an interior shot of the sanctuary. That because of the involvement of these Jewish families in commerce, transatlantic commerce, it makes sense to me that you'd have these groups that were, say, settled in Brazil, but then were settling further north, in this case in New Amsterdam, which later becomes known as New York, and in Rhode Island, and that the Jews in question would actually have their roots going back to Spain and Portugal, which geographically, of course, is much, much closer than Eastern Europe. Here, I wanted to present a few images and examples of Jewish communities from, that are more local to us. So here in Colorado, the first is this wonderful image of the sanctuary at Temple Aaron from Trinidad, Colorado, founded as you see here in 1889. That was founded by several dozen Jewish families from northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. The oldest synagogue in Colorado is Temple Emmanuel, founded in 1874, coincidentally 2 years before Colorado even became a state. And I also wanted to note that, so it starts as its burial and prayer society in 1866, and on their website, I love this line, the largest Jewish congregation between Kansas City and the West Coast. But this image here, I think, is important. This is this Feiner Family Memorial Chapel. So many of the furnishings in this chapel were present when the last Jews were at a small synagogue in Kolín, Czechoslovakia. The artifacts, furniture, symbols, and the Torah here hold the memories of some 480 Jews who lived in Kolín and the over 2,000 Jews who were transported through Kolín to different concentration camps during the Holocaust. 16 of those Jews survived to return to Kolín. And I think what's important here is this is a very physical way in which this community managed to bring surviving material objects and, as I say, carry with them memories and sort of the power of that witness to this horrible experience, and yet the ability to survive that we see in looking at the Holocaust. And I found it very powerful myself when I was reading about this particular chapel. And later on in the presentation, I'll talk about the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, but that will come a little bit later. Shifting over to talk about Islam coming to America, I think one of the best places to start is with the story of Omar ibn Sayyid, born 1770 in Futa Torah, which corresponds to modern-day Senegal. He's enslaved, and approximately the age of 37 is brought forcibly to South Carolina. He lives in the colonies, and then it's the U.S. Until he dies in 1864. What's remarkable about Omar ibn Sayyid's story is that he writes this autobiography in Arabic. You see, he was trained. He was part of from an educated family in Senegal, and so we have this amazing document that he wrote. Here's a picture of it. If you Google his name, you'll find a full translation of it at the National Humanities Center and also through the Library of Congress. But I always love to talk about this story because, the slave autobiographies and sort of former slave autobiographies that we have are these precious pieces that give witness to this darkest chapter in our nation's history. And especially when we have all this rhetoric about Muslims in America and Muslims, go back home and all this stuff, I point to this story as an example. And of course, Omar ibn Sayyid was not the only one. Estimates are between 2.5% to 10% of the slaves who were brought to the U.S. from West Africa were Muslim. Muslims have been here in America before we called it America. And I think that's an important thing to think about when we look at the religious makeup of our nation today. And if you read through Omar ibn Sayyid's autobiography, then he talks about being captured and being brought to the U.S. and how he feels about his various masters, and there's this debate over, did he convert to Christianity, but did he also sort of hold on to this Muslim identity? Um, I think it's just remarkable that we have, an Arabic document written during the, sort of early to mid 19th century. Um, and I don't know of any other ex-slave um, documents from this period in Arabic. So it really is a singular piece of American history, and he's buried in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is not too far from where I used to go to school. So an important part of our history. Another aspect of talking about Islam coming to America is, when these communities start building, well, buildings. And it's interesting to note that the earliest, what's so-called a purpose-built mosque, so a building built to be a mosque, in the U.S. is recognized as being the Mother Mosque in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in 1934. Now, of course, we've had Muslim communities here in this country since before then, and we can also start to talk about the particular role that they played, especially in the pre-1965 period, or we could even say the pre-World War II period. So, if we look at an example such as the Moorish Science Temple, founded in 1913 by Noble Drew Ali, and we see this picture here in the center column, we have an example of a religious movement in which a couple of things are emphasized. One is that Islam is being associated more directly with Africa, um, and that this is part of the reason then that African Americans are sort of being pulled towards claiming and converting to a form of Islamic identity. And you can think of many reasons why they would want to do that. So because the role that Christianity played and continues, to play as this majority religion in the U.S., and yet African Americans have, especially here we're talking 1913, still very much dealing with incredible discrimination and racism. And, even though the African American church, if we think, kind of broadly, is an important social, cultural, political institution, then these other groups, such as the Moorish Science Temple and another group that starts as the Nation of Islam, um, serve as vehicles for what I would call the spiritual uplift as separate from the majority society, and sort of claiming an agency for themselves that was not based in a religious tradition that many people saw as, could not be separated from the oppression that they had experienced. Talking about the Nation of Islam, which is founded in Detroit on July 4th, no accident there, 1930, by Wallace Farad Muhammad, also known as Wallace D. Farad. It's spelled Fard, but it's pronounced Farad. Well, I'll get into a slide later on talking about subsequent leaders of the Nation of Islam, namely Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. But these are examples, I think, of how, these early Muslim communities in the U.S. Are, I wouldn't even say are made up of immigrants so much as the descendants of those who were brought to the U.S. Under the worst conditions imaginable.
Now, it might be tempting to think that these traditions didn't make their debut in the United States until the 20th century, but that's not the case. Buddhism first came to the United States with the California Gold Rush in the mid-1800s. At that time, many Chinese laborers crossed the Pacific to work in California and to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. They also spent a lot of time working as indentured servants or as wage laborers in gold mining operations throughout the Southwest. Those early Chinese immigrants, a huge percentage of them were men, of course brought with them their religious traditions. So they brought Confucian values, they brought Taoist mysticism, and they brought Buddhist sensibilities as well. Similarly, in the late 1800s, there was a large migration of Japanese immigrants into the Hawaiian Islands. They left Japan due to political struggle and unrest that happened as a result of the overthrow of the military government of Japan at the time, called the Tokugawa Shogunate, and the reinstatement of the Meiji Emperor, which all happened in the late 1860s. After that point in Japan, there was a huge movement to re-centralize the government around the imperial family and around the person of the emperor, and the separation between the classes and the financial well-being of the lower classes in Japan really became much worse in the late 1800s. And so we see a huge influx of Japanese immigrants into Hawaii, where they came to work on sugarcane plantations. Of course, those Japanese immigrants also brought with them their religious traditions, mainly Pure Land Buddhism, what's called Jodoshu and Jodoshinshu Buddhism. Those were the earliest Buddhist communities in the United States, those Chinese workers, particularly centered in California, and the Japanese workers who came to Hawaii. Just as a side note, this same time period in the mid-1800s, when Chinese immigration was happening, is one of the reasons that we have the strong Chinatowns that we see all over the West Coast and in New York, actually. There was a huge influx of Chinese immigrants who were really doing extreme physical labor throughout the United States, but most especially working in mining gold and working to build the Transcontinental Railroad. They were also, in many places, you started to see Chinese laundries, interestingly enough, and that's something that continued to be true as those communities became more established and the Chinatowns were established. Chinese laundries were a big part of what a lot of these immigrants did. Just because I'm talking about Chinese and Japanese immigration into the United States, I just also want to mention that it's not just on the coasts that we see these populations. There's a Jodo Shinshu temple in downtown Denver. Jodo Shinshu is what is commonly known as true Pure Land Buddhism from Japan. That temple downtown in Denver was founded in 1898 by missionaries who came from California. So we've had here in the Denver metro the presence of Japanese Pure Land Buddhism since 1898. Now, in 1882, the United States government passed a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. The quote that you see here is just one of many of the very vicious and horrible things that were said at the time. But the general attitude was that a lot of the work for which the Chinese had been brought over had been done, and there was this huge influx of Chinese immigrants who had come into America, And as I mentioned before, most of them were men. Most of them did not bring their families with them. They would come over to work and they were sending money back home. So it was a large population of Chinese men. And the United States government decided that they needed to do something about this large Chinese population. Now, this had been preceded earlier with an act that prohibited the immigration of Chinese women, which was that was called the Page Act in 1875, and that was to limit their ability to bring their families over. It becomes very clear if you study this time period in American history that the general attitude was that these people were welcome to come here and labor for the sake of the United States, but they really were not welcome to become a part of the United States. They were not welcome to become citizens, and they really were not interested in having any of these people actually stay. The only exceptions to this exclusion were diplomats, a handful of teachers. There were some permissions given for students to continue to travel into the United States, and of course merchants, because importing things from the Far East was quite lucrative for American merchants. With this act, it forced some Chinese out of the United States and shut the doors completely to any substantive immigration of Chinese. And there were other acts surrounding the Chinese Exclusion Act that also made it impossible for other groups to immigrate into the United States as well.
In 1893, a major event was held in Chicago called the World's Parliament of Religions. This was a gathering that was, at least initially, intended to prove the superiority of Western religious thought, especially those of the Abrahamic faiths, and of Western rationalism and empiricism. Religious leaders and theologians were invited from all over the world, including from the Middle East and East Asia. If you look closely at this picture, you can see many of the people who gathered for this event, and many of them were from India, from China, and from Japan, as well as from the Middle East, people from Europe and the United States. If you go online and look up the World's Parliament of Religions, you can find transcripts of many of the talks that were given. The Pluralism Project from Harvard University also has an excellent webpage that discusses the Parliament, and I'd like to read here an excerpt from their discussion. The late 19th century produced a distinctive solution to the growing awareness of religious diversity and the problems it posed both in America and in the world. That solution was an all-embracing universalism that envisioned a coming together of the great religions of the world. In 1893, a remarkable event took place in Chicago expressing this spirit, the World's Parliament of Religions. The Parliament was planned as part of the Chicago World's Fair. America's technological triumphs were on display in the White City built to house the huge fair. World congresses were held on medicine, engineering, and women's progress, but many felt that these were overshadowed by the Parliament of Religions, where Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Jews, Protestants, Catholics, Unitarians, and adherents of the Shinto and Zoroastrian traditions met together for the first time in modern history. The event's chairman, Presbyterian minister John Henry Barrows, noted the exposition planner's skepticism, saying, "Many felt that religion was an element of perpetual discord, which should not be thrust in amid the magnificent harmonies of a fraternal assembly of nations. On the other hand, it was felt that the tendencies of modern civilization were toward unity. Some came to feel that a parliament of religions was the necessity of the age." 10,000 invitations were sent out, not just throughout America, but around the world. When responses returned, they voiced approval and excitement, as well as disapproval and suspicion, some hinting at the kind of exclusivism that would come to characterize religious traditions in the late 20th century. For example, the Sultan of Turkey refused the invitation, though his reasoning, whether it was active disapproval or a lack of interest, is unclear. The Archbishop of Canterbury's disapproval was more obvious. As he put it, the Christian religion is the only true religion. However, a professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, was more optimistic. Let an honest effort be made to get at the facts of religious experience, and the truth of God will take care of itself, he said. As the Parliament began that September, a replica of the Liberty Bell rang out 10 times, once for each of the major religious traditions represented. At the opening session, the Reverend Barrows proclaimed, "We are met together today as men, children of one God. We are not here as Baptists and Buddhists, Catholics and Confucians, Parsis and Presbyterians, Methodists and Muslims. We are here as members of a parliament of religions over which flies no sectarian flag." The predominant spirit of the 3-week-long event was a kind of welcoming universalism or inclusivism on the part of the Western, mostly Christian, hosts. From every religion, however, speakers optimistically affirmed the universal principles that surely would undergird all faiths. The word universalism tolled like a bell through the halls of the Parliament. The world stood on the technological brink of a global civilization, and the hope for the universal in all matters of the spirit was just beginning to be voiced. For example, many Reform Jews saw the social and religious vision of Judaism as the ethical leavening for all humanity. Chicago Rabbi Emil Hirsch titled his talk, "Elements of a Universal Religion," and declared national affinities and memories, however potent for good, and no more spiritual than racial bonds, are still too narrow to serve as foundation stones for the temple of all humanity. The day of national religions is past. The God of the universe speaks to all mankind. The Parliament was the first time that many Americans had ever heard Hindus or Buddhists speak in their own voices and on behalf of their own faith. Swami Vivekananda, a Hindu, confirmed the vision of universal convergence that had captured the imagination of the planners. Their self-understanding was confirmed, mirrored back to themselves in the presence of this exotic Swami from the East, who was one of the most popular speakers at the Parliament. One journalist wrote of him, "Vivekananda's address before the Parliament was broad as the heavens above us, embracing the best in all religions as the ultimate universal religion, charity to all mankind, good works for the love of God, not for fear of punishment or hope or reward." The language of the universal was wielded eloquently by the Christian participants as well. Some presumed, however, that the Parliament, over which flew no sectarian flag, was convened in a spacious but clearly Christian tent. Christians claimed universality for Christianity while listening with earnestness to the witness of Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus. It became clear that even Barrow's conception of the universal was but a larger and more expansive form of Christianity. Barrows recalled with satisfaction how all the representatives of the great historic religions recited the Lord's Prayer together daily. The Christian spirit, he wrote, pervaded the conference from the first day to the last. Christ's prayer was used daily. His name was always spoken with reverence. His doctrine was preached by 100 Christians and by lips other than Christians. The Parliament, he argued, ended at Calvary. There were many voices at the Parliament that stressed not the universal, but the real differences between and within religions. Their voices made clear the difficult tasks that lay ahead and forecast the complex challenges that religious diversity would pose for the 20th century. The Buddhist reformer Anagarika Dharmapala asked the audience in a large lecture hall, "How many of you have read the life of the Buddha?" When only 5 raised a hand, he scolded them. 5 only. 475 million people accept our religion of love and hope. You call yourselves a nation, a great nation, and yet you do not know the history of this great teacher. How dare you judge us? One of the Buddhists from Japan was equally challenging, pointing to the anti-Japanese feeling he had met in America and deploring the signs that read, "No Japanese is allowed to enter here." "If such be the Christian ethic," he said, "we are perfectly satisfied to be heathens." Of the major speakers, only two were African American. Frederick Douglass called the White City created for the event a whitened sepulchre for blacks. Fanny Barrier Williams declared, "It is a monstrous thing that nearly one half of the so-called evangelical churches of this country repudiate and haughtily deny fellowship to every Christian lady and gentleman happening to be of African descent." She challenged Christians to take seriously their own religion. Among the women who spoke was the first ordained as a minister in America, Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who declared, "Women are needed in the pulpit as imperatively and for the same reason they are needed in the world, because they are women." And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had been working on the Women's Bible, called for a religion that would preach the dignity of all human beings. A new world, she said, would have to be built in a house with the cellar first, and that meant justice for the poorest. Finally, despite sentiments of universal fellowship expressed at the Parliament, there were no Native Americans present except as curiosities displayed on the fair's midway. For many visitors, these so-called Indians were as exotic as was Swami Vivekananda. But no native elder or chief was invited to speak at the Parliament. Native American lifeways were not yet seen as a spiritual perspective. Just 3 years earlier, Chief Sitting Bull had been arrested and killed, the ghost dance had been suppressed, and 350 Sioux had been massacred at Wounded Knee Creek. As the Parliament concluded, many felt that the Universalist vision should be sustained. One of the Unitarian conveners suggested that the representatives of the world's traditions convene again in 1900 on the banks of the Ganges in the ancient city of Benares. This was not to be, but there was a meeting in Boston in 1900 of a new group, the International Council of Unitarian and Other Liberal Religious Thinkers and Workers. It came to include a few Muslims, Jews, Catholics, and reformist Hindus. Its agenda of international congresses addressed the question of justice for women and the expansion of narrow patriotism to a wider human loyalty. From this seed grew the International Association for Religious Freedom. 2 world wars would impede the progress of organized interreligious efforts such as this one, but the wars would at the same time underline the importance of interreligious efforts. When the original Parliament had concluded, the Reverend Barrows reflected, "Religion, like the white light of heaven, had been broken into many colored fragments by the prisms of men. One of the objects of the Parliament of Religions has been to change this many-colored radiance back into the white light of heavenly truth. When the centennial of the 1893 Parliament convened in 1993, the religious face of America had changed radically. By this time, America itself had become a truly multi-religious country, and the Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, Sikh, and Jewish organizers were residents of a very different Chicago." While the earliest intentions of the world's parliament might have been a bit one-sided, the parliament has continued to develop and still exists today. The most recent meeting was in Toronto in 2018. Today the parliament's mission states, "The Parliament of the World's Religions seeks to promote interreligious harmony rather than unity. The problem with seeking unity among religions is the risk of loss of the unique and precious character of each individual religious and spiritual tradition. This understanding is key to our framework. Interreligious harmony, on the other hand, is an attainable and highly desirable goal. Such an approach respects and is enriched by the particularities of each tradition. Moreover, within each tradition are the resources, philosophical, theological, and spiritual teachings and perspectives that enable each to enter into respectful, appreciative, and cooperative relationships with persons and communities of other traditions. We live in a world of difference, yet we are interdependent. Nowhere is learning to live with difference more important than in religion. Too often, religion is misused as an instrument for division and injustice, betraying the very ideals and teachings that lie at the heart of each of the world's great traditions. At the same time, religious and spiritual traditions shape the lives of billions in wonderful ways. They gather people in communities of shared beliefs and practices. When these diverse communities work in harmony for the common good, there is hope that the world can be transformed. Over the years, the Parliament has initiated dialogues and nurtured relationships among people of difference. In doing so, the Parliament has provided a framework for expressing many visions of a just, peaceful, and sustainable future. In the process, religious and spiritual communities have discovered a shared commitment to ethical principles. This shared commitment has opened the way for a new era of cooperative action among the world's religious and spiritual communities, as well as civil and political societies. The well-being of the earth and all life depends on this collaboration.
So now to talk about Abrahamic traditions at the famous 1893 World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. As you can probably guess, even though they invited all of these people from around the world, it's an event kind of from beginning to end that's really dominated by the Christians, right? And this guy here in the center, Reverend John Henry Barrows, who is a pastor at Chicago's First Presbyterian Church at the time, is sort of the titular head of the parliament. We've read these accounts of invitations that were rejected by the Sultan of Turkey, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the head of European Roman Catholic clergy. Even Barrow's own church was supposedly not that interested in participating, but it was sort of his private cause. We only know of one Muslim participant, Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb, who is an American convert to Islam, former U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, and coincidentally born a Presbyterian. There were multiple Jewish representatives, including prominent Reform Rabbi Isaac M. Wise and Rabbi Joseph Silverman. Silverman, coincidentally, was the first American-born rabbi to serve in New York City, after I believe he had served as a rabbi for a few communities in Texas. There were also 19 women who spoke at this event, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, author of the Women's Bible, and Antoinette Brown Blackwell, the first ordained woman in America. And I think for me, a central takeaway from this, in terms of looking at the Abrahamic traditions, my colleague Thomas discusses the impact of people like Swami Vivekananda that had on the crowd, and really serving as this model of these other religious traditions. But I want to emphasize that this, the majority of the speakers were Christian. It seems clear that the majority of the speakers who were Christian saw it as an event to demonstrate that everyone of good sense would eventually come around to accepting the good news and embrace Christianity. And so if we compare to, say, the 1993 Parliament of Religions that they held, if you read reviews of that or summaries of it, it's a very different tone and less about evangelizing and more about giving, sort of equal airtime, if you will, to all the many different traditions of the world. But it is certainly a landmark event, and it did change a lot of things in terms of the perceptions that people had of certain traditions. I think it probably did more from the so-called Eastern religious tradition side in terms of sharing information about those traditions here in the U.S., as opposed to changing people's conceptions about Islam and Judaism, for example.
Now, just to consider a few of the voices that spoke at the Parliament, I'd like to mention three people. First,
on the right side of the screen is the Honorable Peng Kuan-yu. Peng Kuan-yu was from China. He spoke at length about Confucianism and was very well received. Many of the comments that were made about him praised him for his friendliness and his joviality, which really was an indication of how he himself lived out some of the values that we see represented in Confucianism, especially in terms of how you're supposed to treat other human beings. Next was the Reverend Horin Toki. He was from Japan, and as best I can tell, he was a Tendai Buddhist priest. Tendai is one of the esoteric schools of Japanese Buddhism, and it's important to note that Tendai is also the school of Buddhism in Japan that sort of acts as the mother school of Buddhism. Many of the other schools of Buddhism, such as the schools of Zen and the Pure Land schools and the Nichiren schools, all of them have roots in Tendai Buddhism. He talked a lot about the Lotus Sutra, which is a central text for the Tendai school, and about the Japanese view of the Buddhist clergy, and about a Buddhist establishment rooted in a Mahayana worldview rather than in a worldview based on early Buddhism, which is what we would find in places like Sri Lanka and Thailand, Burma. Since the 9th century, Japanese Buddhism has been really predicated on this Mahayana worldview. Ultimately, Japanese clergy take their ordination using precepts that are based on Mahayana precepts, which is different from how Buddhist ordination happens really pretty much anywhere else in the world. So this was really the primary focus of his talk. And then finally, on the left side there is Swami Vivekananda from India. His speech at the World Parliament of Religions was one of the most impactful moments, probably of the entire gathering. At the time of the Parliament, we have to remember that most religious scholars would have been theologians, or at least would have been sort of theologically oriented. And because of that, they really weren't expecting much from these individuals coming from non-Abrahamic cultures and backgrounds. They would have viewed a lot of these East Asian speakers and teachers as being somewhat backwards. They would have seen them as being relatively superstitious. They wouldn't have expected any of them to be academically minded. And many of the speakers proved them wrong, maybe most especially Swami Vivekananda. As I mentioned in the slide that I did for the Parliament itself, the talk that was given by Swami Vivekananda really shocked and inspired people. He talked at length about the Hindu concept of Brahman, sort of a unifying, universal reality, the cosmic reality of divinity. And though many of the scholars who gathered for the World's Parliament were expecting the meeting to sort of prove the superiority of Western thought, instead they were challenged by the insights and thoughtfulness, really, of the many speakers who gathered, and they were forced to acknowledge that religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, Confucianism, Jainism, Sikhism, all really not only deserved a place on the world stage, but already held a place on the world stage as venerable and long-practiced religious traditions. If you're interested in more about Swami Vivekananda, there is a movie that was made, recently, within the last, 20 years or so, that talks about the World's Parliament. You can find links to that movie on YouTube even, and you can find a recording from that movie of an actor doing Swami Vivekananda's speech. You might also be able to find other recordings of readings of Swami Vivekananda's speech, or you can go to the website for the Parliament of World Religions, and the transcript for his speech is on that website. Following his success at the World Parliament of Religions, Swami Vivekananda began to travel around the United States giving lectures and talks. And he started to set up groups called the Vedanta Society. And this really was the beginning of some of the sort of early communities that were discussing yoga. However, Swami Vivekananda and his understanding of yoga really was the philosophical understanding of yoga. So we see that the earliest exposure in the United States to yoga was really through things like Vedanta, and through philosophical concepts, and probably through some meditation as well. When Swami Vivekananda was speaking and writing about yoga, there was not a lot of agreement, at least within America, as to what exactly yoga even was. It could have just as easily been understood as some kind of a dietary program, or a system of mental concentration, or as breathing techniques. And truth be told, it was very often perceived as being magical in nature. We have these fantastic accounts of Indian wonders in print and in stage magicians who would put on turbans and robes and do like magic shows and things like that. This was really what people at the turn of the 19th to 20th century associated with yoga. They thought of these yogis wearing turbans who would lie on beds of nails. This was the image of the yogi. The rise of posture-based form of yoga, what we call hatha yoga, really occurred in the early 20th century. And it largely had to do with sort of a blending of physical yoga postures with Western exercise and Western medicine. One of the most important people in that phase of the development of yoga in the United States was a man named Swami Kuvalayananda, who helped to sort of place the practice of yoga within a larger context of medicine and health. During the 1920s and 1930s, yoga obtained more public or a higher profile in the United States, largely because of Indian immigrants who were already living in the United States at the time. They had lost their citizenship and rights through a series of court cases and federal legislation, similar to the Chinese Exclusion Act that we talked about. Dozens of these people who had been college students, they'd been professionals, they'd been political activists, didn't really have much of a choice. They had to kind of reinvent themselves and reimagine themselves. And they remade themselves into essentially mystics. And they traveled around the United States, making a living by giving public lectures and private classes and by teaching yoga. And so by the end of the 1930s, we start to see this shift from a worldview or a perception of yoga as either being this purely philosophical thing that people were getting from Swami Vivekananda and the Vedanta Society, or from the purely mystical practice of these people lying on beds of nails. And we start to see a shift towards an awareness of yoga as being something that supports health and well-being. We start to see like
bodybuilding magazines from the 30s and 40s, showing yoga and showing yoga teachers, working with their students. In the 20s, a teacher from India came to the United States named Paramahansa Yogananda. He's probably most famous for his book, Autobiography of a Yogi. And he came to the United States hoping to continue work in sort of the same vein as Swami Vivekananda and the World's Parliament. He was looking to sort of bridge Eastern and Western religions and to teach. He was really focused on teaching a balance between Western material growth and Indian spirituality or Eastern spirituality. He's often referred to as the father of yoga in the West. And he was really, really influential in bringing people's awareness to yoga, most especially probably through his book. I think his book was so widely read that people began to see interest and value in these Hindu practices, in the practice of yoga. And certainly Yogananda was teaching the physical practices of asana, what's called asana posture, yoga. But he was also teaching meditation and self-cultivation as part of how he worked with his students in America. A lot of modern yoga practitioners credit this book as being a huge influence on how they got into practicing yoga in the first place. So we really see that the introduction of Hindu spirituality, Indian spirituality into the United States, though there was some presence prior to Swami Vivekananda's appearance at the World's Parliament, it really begins to gain momentum and steam from Swami Vivekananda's appearance. And then it starts to continue to grow from that point. When we see these other individuals coming onto the scene and beginning to teach in their own right, and we see this juxtaposition and sort of back and forth between the philosophical principles of yoga and the physical practice of yoga as a benefit to health and wellness really have been there from the very beginning. It's not a new problem or a new challenge for yoga in the modern period. I feel that it's important, if we're going to talk about the presence and experience of these religious traditions in America, that we step back and talk a little bit about the realities of what happened during the Second World War in the United States. As many of you probably know, during the Second World War, Japanese Americans, whether they had been born in Japan and had immigrated to America, or whether they themselves had been born here, were systematically rounded up, taken out of their homes, and put into internment camps all over the United States. This was true even for American citizens who were second, third, and even in some cases fourth generation Americans of Japanese ancestry. These camps were often in remote and hostile environments in the United States. Many of them were quite secluded and quite hostile environments. The people who were put into those camps were most often still practicing the religious traditions that their parents or grandparents had practiced. And in most cases, that meant that they were practicing some form of Japanese Buddhism. Most often, it would have been what's called either Jodo Shu or Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, Pure Land or True Pure Land Buddhism. In some cases, it was one of the esoteric Japanese Buddhist traditions, Shingon Shu or Tendai Shu, or even Nichiren Shu Buddhism. All of these forms of Buddhism were taken with these citizens into the internment camps. So during the Second World War, Buddhism was actively being practiced by Japanese Americans who had been rounded up and put into these internment camps. In these photographs, you see pictures that were taken in some of these camps. The first picture on the left is from a funeral that was performed at Topaz Relocation Center in Utah. And you can see there, just behind the casket, the Buddhist priest in his robes. And on the right, you see the dedication of an altar for Hanamatsuri at Heart Mountain in Wyoming. Hanamatsuri is a celebration of the birthday of the Buddha. Both of these pictures are part of the remaining records that we have about this time period in American history. And aside from the historical value as part of the history of this country and of the Second World War, for our purposes, these pictures really are an example of the ways in which Buddhism really already had a substantive presence in the United States prior to the Second World War, and that people really were actively engaging Buddhist religious faith and practice in the U.S. going back long before what we think of as the modern period, and going back long before what we will see in other examples of Buddhism in the West. But these are examples of Buddhism still being practiced within communities that were largely culturally homogenous. So you're still seeing that Buddhism exists in the United States prior to the Second World War in communities that are Japanese American or in other cases Chinese American. We don't yet see a large population of non-East Asian peoples practicing these religious traditions.
Now, moving to looking at Christianity in America during the post-World War II period, I think one of the most significant changes, comes when John F. Kennedy is elected president, the first Roman Catholic to serve in that role. Here he's pictured with Pope Pius VI, and this was exactly the image that was so disturbing to many Protestants who feared that Kennedy would basically do the Pope's bidding. If you look at something like editorial cartoons from the 1800s, there's a lot in there as we get increased immigration from Germany and Italy and Ireland, countries with pretty significant Catholic populations. There's all this concern that these Catholics are coming and are going to serve as this fifth column, and there's all this Protestant anxiety. And so Kennedy had to address that when he was running in the early 60s for office. And there's a famous speech he gives before some Presbyterian bishops in Texas, where he sort of addresses, I'm an American first, I'm not a Catholic first, and that was seen as assuaging a lot of this anxiety. It's also important to note that this type of, frankly, this bigotry against Catholics is a holdover from the Catholic-Protestant wars in Europe. And so when these primarily Protestant groups began immigrating to the U.S. and colonizing it, they brought with them that same type of prejudice. Another significant development is, someone like Billy Graham, right? These evangelists who then, later on we could say become televangelists, right? When technology allows it. And Billy Graham was one of the most famous evangelical preachers of the 20th century, beginning with his missions in 1948. And, unlike some other evangelical preachers who ascended to great fame, he really avoided scandals. During the 1970s, we see a huge rise more broadly in evangelical groups. We could look at, our local sort of what I think of as a nexus of evangelical influence and power in Colorado Springs, with groups like Focus on the Family and even groups like Young Life. We have all these different evangelical groups that are centered in Colorado Springs. It's a real center. And then, as I mentioned, with televangelism, the advent of cable TV provides this new outlet for lots of ministers of many different denominations to reach millions across the country. An estimated 25% of the U.S. population identifies as evangelical. So even though these groups don't really exist with the same type of denominational hierarchy and structure that we might think of as with Catholics or Presbyterians, they are a massive group, and anyone wanting to learn about Christianity in America, really you have to look at evangelicals as a huge influence. The other thing I think is important to talk about, at least here in this slide, are these mega churches. So here, this is like the stadium, if you look at it over here. And, it's hard to imagine that many thousands of people all together at once, as I record this during the height of a surge of the coronavirus here in nearly mid-November 2020. But these megachurches, host tens of thousands of worshipers, and they really offer a separate, distinct community for their members. And I think we can note this connection between the growth of megachurches in the latter half of the 20th century with the first and second Great Awakenings in earlier eras of American history, that there's this emotional connection that is drawn between the leaders, the pastors of these churches, and their flock, if you will. There's actually a book that I'll put in the further reading section called High on God, that looks at mega churches and how I think the subtitle is How Mega Churches Captured America's Heart. And it really looks in depth at the emotional experience that parishioners or that people report experiencing attending mega churches. You've got the sound and light show, you've got the social outreach, and there's also just an impact of scale, that when you have a community that is so large, it really taps into this core need that many people have to feel connected to this much larger community. So in a standalone presentation on Christianity that I did earlier in this series, I noted that we can start to predict political affiliation based on race, even when it comes to, say, to evangelicals, that African Americans who identify as evangelical are much more likely to vote with the Democratic Party, whereas whites who identify as evangelical are much more typically expected to vote with the Republican Party. We have this increased diversity that starts to complicate those affiliations, and specifically, we have a growing number of Asian and Latinx Christians who identify as evangelical, and they often have different social or different positions on social and cultural issues than white evangelicals. All of this complicates our expectations in terms of how people will vote and what their priorities are, if we look solely at their religious identity. So, we used to think of Catholics as voting largely with the Democratic Party, but that has really changed. We think of evangelicals, again, in general, especially white evangelicals, as voting exclusively for the Republican Party, but I think that too is no longer something that can be taken so much for granted. On the right-hand side, I want to note that this recent elevation of Wilton Gregory um, is recently named by Pope Francis to the College of Cardinals. Here's Gregory. So he's the first African American cardinal. And so I wanted to note something else, that when we think about Roman Catholicism in the US, we tend to associate it with these white communities. Um, and I think even that is important to note, how the narrative around specifically Catholic identity has shifted. You know, a century ago, we would have thought of Irish and Italian and German communities as basically being their own ethnicities, um, unto themselves. You know, you can find these incredibly discriminatory signs like, you know, Irish need not apply and so forth, and that's all bound up in anti-Catholicism that then gets transposed onto Irish um, immigrants. And but it's important to note that we have these African American Catholic communities, and of course we have huge numbers of Latinx um, Catholics. Although, as I noted more, there is a growing number of Latinx evangelicals. So all these things are shifting, and it's going to be really fascinating to see how it turns out, let's say in the next 100 years. You know, what will Christianity in America really look like? Um, it definitely is losing its market share, if we use that type of more like economic kind of economics or a spiritual marketplace um, language. But I think it will continue to be an important set of institutions. You know, it's Christianity in America is by no means a monolith, um, and we can see, you know, so as I speak, what's the date today? It is November 12th. Um, and you know, Joseph R. Biden is president elect. He's Catholic, and yet the fact that he's Catholic, and I believe he's just the second Roman Catholic elected to the presidency, I have not seen any real coverage of his Catholicism, at least in the media outlets that I look at. But yet, if we went back to the early '60s when John F. Kennedy Jr. Um, John F. Kennedy was elected, this was huge. This was a huge thing, that a Catholic was elected. So even that's, you know, not even, that's less than 100 years. And I think we'll continue to see more shifts like that. In talking about Jews in America, sort of post World War II, I think one key issue to discuss is sort of this response to the Holocaust, where, you know, approximately 1/3 of the Jews in Europe died. In the post-World War II, we see American Jewish communities taking on greater and greater leadership roles. We have the modern nation-state of Israel, founded in 1948, which the U.S. has consistently supported both politically and militarily. During the post-World War II period, Jews became increasingly integrated within American society. This complicated the country's long-standing emphasis on Protestantism as the default religious and cultural norm. Another institution I want to talk about is the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which was founded in 1980 and then opened to the public in 93. We can look at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum as really continuing and building on the work started by the Anti-Defamation League, founded to combat anti-Semitism in the early 1900s. Jewish communities in America continue to face anti-Semitism, which has become even more violent in recent years, as evidenced by the October 2018 shootings at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, in which 11 people lost their lives. Moving on to talk more about Judaism sort of in the post-World War II period, I think a key thing to note is the ordination of female rabbis beginning in 1972 with Sally Priesand, the first woman ordained by a Jewish cemetery, by Hebrew Union College and the Jewish Institute of Religion. It's important to note also, though, that Regina Jones, who died in 1944, is believed to be the first ever female rabbi. She was a 1930 graduate of the Academy for the Science of Judaism, or in German, the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, where she wrote a thesis entitled "Can a Woman Be a Rabbi According to Halachic Sources?" I should note that she perished with so many others at Auschwitz. In the decades since Sally Priesand's ordination here in the U.S., we have seen more and more women enter the rabbinate across the three main denominations of Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Judaism. Another key issue that has been debated increasingly within American Jewish communities is their position on Zionism and determining the extent of their support for the modern nation-state of Israel. So it's important, I think, especially for those of us who aren't Jewish and don't know much about Jewish communities, to emphasize that this is not a monolithic community, that we have really distinctive political opinions between Israeli and U.S. Jewish communities, and within Israeli and within U.S. Jewish communities. So, for example, I have learned that President Trump is actually quite popular in Israel, but much less so amongst American Jews. Zionism, which starts in the 19th century primarily in Eastern Europe as a movement to create a Jewish homeland where Jews from across the world can live in safety after centuries of persecution, is a political movement with deeply religious roots. For American Jewish communities, many of which have long-standing ties to anti-racist movements in the U.S. dating back to the 1960s, there can sometimes be this tension between wanting to support the state of Israel, but also being concerned with some of the Israeli government's policies towards the Palestinian territories that it basically oversees. So there's a famous photo here that I think ties into this long-standing Jewish connection to the civil rights movement and anti-racism. And this is with Rabbi Joshua Heschel marching with Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders in Selma, Alabama in 1965. And I think, when we look at these institutions that have been formed by Jewish communities in the U.S., such as the Anti-Defamation League, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, we see this, this experience of anti-Semitism and wanting to not only put an end to it, but also working to end discrimination and oppression and suffering that other communities are experiencing. For example, when there were these horrible accounts emerging, like in the mid-2000s, early to mid-2000s, from Darfur, the western state province of Sudan, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum was really at the forefront of issuing reports and press releases and trying to get the word out to raise the profile of this crisis in the public eye here in the U.S. And they were doing that because that's part of their mission, is to prevent genocide from happening no matter where and no matter who is concerned. And I think that's a really important part that I see in Jewish communities today in the U.S. So as I referenced in the earlier slide, looking at Islam in America before World War II, when we go post World War II, I do think that the Nation of Islam is really a key organization. So shown here is its former leader, Elijah Muhammad, who died in 1975. A key example or a good example of his teachings would be the Message to the Black Man in America, which was published in 1965, and part of his message that white supremacy was so deeply ingrained in American institutions that the only path to freedom would require African Americans to form their own separate community. Now, this would take the form of different schools, different, even a different farming system, really trying to become self-sufficient. And I would note that this is actually not very different from what we see from a lot of other, we'll say, non-Protestant religious communities in the U.S. If we look at the experience of Roman Catholic communities who immigrated, oftentimes you would see them build a school before they built an official, church or sanctuary. And I've read the same thing with Jewish communities. And you can easily imagine why that is if you view the public school system as basically a sectarian Protestant system, and in the case of Roman Catholics, a scholar like Jay Dolan has amassed all this documentary evidence of anti-Catholic discrimination that students would experience. We're talking about kids. People wanted to protect their children from what they saw as a discriminatory educational system. And so you would prioritize building schools as a way of really putting down roots of your own in this, whatever community you were living in. Going back to the Nation of Islam, certainly one of their most famous leaders was Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925. He's assassinated in New York City in 1965. He also was known as El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, following his completion of the Hajj, or the pilgrimage, to Mecca in 1964. He eventually, later in life, sort of around the time he went on the Hajj, he left the Nation of Islam and formed his own group. And, as his message and his teachings departed from that of the Nation of Islam, then that I think led to his assassination in 1965. Malcolm X was an incredibly brilliant orator. Many of his speeches are available online, not just in print, but in video format, which is an incredible blessing if you want to look at one of the most influential civil rights leaders from the 20th century, certainly. Another thing to discuss here as we move into kind of this post-World War II period is, with the immigration changes that change in 1965, we see increased immigration from the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia. These are all regions that have very sizable Muslim communities. And so we see then the blending, or the sort of getting to know one another, of these African American Muslim communities, such as the Nation of Islam, and then groups from Syria, from Egypt, from India, and eventually Pakistan, Bangladesh, from Malaysia, from Indonesia. And that led to some interesting changes within, kind of on both sides, but especially we could look at a group like the Nation of Islam, where they changed some of their practices over time, especially when Elijah Muhammad's son, Warith Din Muhammad, when he becomes leader after his father's death, and sort of that some people would see as bringing the Nation of Islam closer to especially a Sunni Muslim way of practicing. Maybe I can go into more detail on that, a future presentation just focused in on Islam in America, because that's a wonderful topic. And I have some great resources on Islam in America, along with Christianity and Judaism in America, at the end of the presentation. Something else I think is important to look at when we get even more, recent, is, as I mentioned, with Jewish Americans becoming more embedded within important cultural and political institutions in the U.S., we definitely see this as well with Muslim Americans. So here's some wonderful pictures. We have Keith Ellison, who was elected to the House of Representatives from Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2006, and he's being sworn in on Thomas Jefferson's copy of the Quran, in translation. Now, Ellison was also the first African American from Minnesota elected to national office. However, I think understandably, the media made a much bigger deal out of him being the first Muslim elected to national office in this country. And right next to them are Rashida Tlaib of Michigan and Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, both elected in 2018. They're the first Muslim women elected to national office. Tlaib also happened to use Jefferson's Quran for her swearing-in ceremony. At the same time that we have these Muslims elected to national office, we also see the continued presence of Islamophobia, even at the level of, U.S. official foreign policy, such as the 2017 so-called Muslim ban, or Executive Order 13769, which severely restricted immigration from a series of Muslim-majority countries. So when I think about this in light of the fact that, Ellison is African American, Tlaib is the daughter of Palestinian immigrants, and Omar herself immigrated to the U.S. from Somalia, we see this incredible diversity, and we see these communities, different parts of the U.S., really continuing to, if anything, just put down deeper and deeper roots and asserting correctly that, they are a vital part of this sort of diverse fabric that we might call the tapestry of America. For a more local note, I want to just offer up this photo of the Colorado Muslim Society, founded in 1964 in Aurora, Colorado, so kind of southeast, Denver Metro. And, this is the largest Muslim community, largest mosque in the state of Colorado. This particular mosque, the construction began in 1978, and it's a solid presence in the community today.
In 1965, the U.S. government passed the Immigration and Nationality Act. Now, this act undid all the exclusion acts which had come before, in essence, erasing all of those laws which excluded these different ethnic and cultural groups. What we see with the Immigration and Nationality Act is that the doors are really thrown open to people from all over East Asia, allowing them to come to the U.S. And seek citizenship. With this act, there is a greater opportunity for an exchange of ideas, and there seems, at least, to be a greater openness to cultural and religious diversity in the United States. We start to see a lot more of a presence of these cultures that we've been discussing appearing throughout the U.S. at this point. This is the 60s, so we start to see a lot more increase in cultural diversity at that time. In many ways, this act was very quiet in its execution. When Lyndon Johnson signed this act, he acknowledged that it wasn't going to change anybody's life overnight. But he did say that it was high time that we began to work to undo some of those exclusionary policies that had been put in place with the Exclusion Acts that were passed in the latter half of the 19th century. Following the interest in yoga and Hindu spirituality that we saw in the early 20th century, that momentum really continued into the middle of the 20th century, and especially once we get into the late 50s and the early 60s, we start to see a growing popularity of not only yoga as an exercise practice, but really of the spiritual underpinnings that support yoga. This is also helped in great fact by the popularity of the Beatles, interestingly enough, who, as many of you may recall, became very interested in Hindu and Eastern spiritualities. In fact, George Harrison became a student of a Hindu guru and remained very committed to his practice of Hinduism throughout his life. But all of the Beatles went to India and studied and spent time in an ashram. And that exposure to Hinduism through popular culture really helped to bring awareness internationally to Hindu spiritualities. Additionally, as we get into the 60s, the Summer of Love and some of the hippie movements, things like that, we start to see that many people in America become dissatisfied, even disenfranchised with what we might think of as mainstream religious movements. Of course, that in America, that most especially means mainstream Christianity. And we start to see a shift in the younger generation towards a sort of interest in spirituality versus religion. And many of those young people turned to Eastern spiritualities to sort of fill in the gaps of what they felt that they were missing in the Western spiritualities that they were given growing up. Into that mix, we start to see these spiritual teachers coming into the United States, or we see people from the United States traveling to India, learning from spiritual teachers, which are called gurus, and then coming back. Maybe the most popular example of an American who went to India and came back and began to teach is a man named Ram Dass. He's probably best known for his book Be Here Now, which he published in 1971. And he really helped to popularize Hindu spirituality in America. He had students all over the United States. He was teaching yoga and meditation. And he himself was also quite a charismatic individual. And he really spent a lot of his time just teaching about an understanding of the divine as love. Of course, from the earliest part of the 20th century, we just continue to see the growth of the practice of yoga, the exercise practice of yoga. And this really just continues to grow and flourish from the 60s all the way up to the present day. And we see many examples of yoga practices that have been developed both in India and in the United States that build on this momentum of what was happening in the 60s and 70s. Here I'm thinking about things like Bikram yoga. A lot of people are interested in hot yoga these days. But we're also seeing, alongside this growth in the popularity of yoga as exercise, a growing awareness of the spiritual and philosophical concepts that have traditionally supported the practice of yoga. And we see more and more Western yoga teachers who are learning and studying about the philosophical roots of yoga, which means that they're studying Hindu philosophy and religious thought. Most especially, I'm thinking about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, but I'm also thinking about the basic texts of Vedanta, most especially Advaita Vedanta. Similarly, we see that many gurus in India, starting in the 60s, started to get followings of Western students, whether that was because those Western students were going to India and encountering these teachers and then coming back and establishing communities, or because those teachers themselves were beginning to travel internationally. Some of you may remember a Hindu guru called Sai Baba, who had a huge following and still has a huge following. And maybe the most popular modern example of a guru in the modern world is Mata Amritananda Mayi. She's more commonly referred to as Amma, or the hugging saint of India. And Amma is viewed as being an incarnation of the divine, sort of like an avatar or a saint in a way. And she travels internationally. Her main place of operation is in India, but she comes to the United States quite often and often visits Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she has a satellite ashram. And people come from all over the world to see her when she is traveling. She will set up in the main hall of her ashram, and people will line up, and people sometimes wait in line for literally hours and hours. And every person who waits in line, Amma receives them individually and hugs them, and then sends them on her way, or on their way, rather, which is why she's referred to as the hugging saint of India. Many people say that when you're with Amma in that moment when she hugs you, you feel as if you are the only being in the entire world, that she's completely and totally invested in the person that she is with at that time. So these are ways in which Hinduism continues to grow and develop in American society. We see that though the popularity of yoga has really continued to grow since the early 20th century and continues to be very present today. I mean, you can go to any gym just about and find yoga classes being offered, and usually if they're offered in that kind of a public setting, they're going to be very exercise oriented. Still, many people are starting to become aware that that form of yoga as exercise, has largely been divorced from the spiritual underpinnings that influenced the development of yoga as a system in India. So more people are becoming interested in at least understanding the philosophical concepts, even if they're not interested in the religious concepts. Additionally, of course, one of the things I haven't really talked about at length in my presentations is that there is a huge diaspora population or immigrant population of Indian people in the United States, Indian Americans. And in many large cities, you'll find beautiful, large Hindu temples that have been built to support those Indian populations. Chicago has a really spectacular Indian temple there, and many other large cities do as well. So we're seeing that there is a disparity between the ways in which ethnic Indians practice their religion, in a way picked up and moved over from India, and the ways in which American Westerners have sort of adopted the practice of Indian spirituality within this culture. And sometimes the two meet and mix, and more often they do not. Following the Second World War, Buddhism really got a boost in the United States. Probably the first major player in that shift was a man named Shunryu Suzuki. Now, he came over from Japan to serve the Soto-Zen Buddhist temple in San Francisco. That temple is, or was at that time at least, supporting a Japanese American population. So when Suzuki Roshi came over, he was not coming over to teach Westerners. He was coming over to serve a population that was still largely culturally Japanese. However, pretty quickly, Suzuki Roshi decided that he wanted to more actively engage the population of San Francisco, and he started to teach Westerners, which was a huge shift in the behavior and outlook of a Buddhist priest at that time. Now, understand that in the traditional model in Japan, lay practitioners of Buddhism would not do the kinds of things that we associate with Buddhism today. For a lay person in general, the practice would be to come to the temple and offer incense and say some prayers. They would make donations to support the temple. They might come to the temple for special occasions or festivals, at which point there would be a short ritual and the priest would likely give some kind of a talk. And most commonly, lay people would rely on Buddhist temples and Buddhist clergy to deal with funerary rites. Buddhism in Japan is largely responsible for anything to do with funerals and the care of the ancestors. Suzuki Roshi realized pretty quickly that that was not a model that would work with Americans. So he adopted a sort of a hybrid model where he taught Westerners to meditate, which was largely a practice reserved for Buddhist clergy in Japan. So he begins to teach Westerners, begins to teach them to meditate, and establishes what is today known as the San Francisco Zen Center. It still exists today. And they also begin to establish residential communities outside of the city. They have a farm called Green Gulch and another residential community called Tassajara, both of which are outside of San Francisco. And he also wrote really his most famous book, which is called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which, you know, if you're doing any kind of study of Buddhism in America or any kind of study of Zen in general, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind is an absolute must read. About the same time, we start to see the rise of the Beat generation and the Beat poets. Jack Kerouac is doing his writing at this point, and he spends a lot of time writing about his encounters with Buddhism and the influence that some of the early Buddhist teachers had on him, as well as his own reading of early Buddhist texts. Probably most notable is his book Dharma Bums. Kerouac's work really influenced other authors and poets like Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg at one point lived in Boulder, Colorado, and Ginsberg himself became a student of Tibetan Buddhism and wrote extensively about Buddhist concepts and philosophy in his own poetry and writing. The other person I feel like I should mention in the early period of Buddhism coming or becoming more mainstream is Taizan Maezumi Roshi. Maezumi Roshi came over a little while after Suzuki Roshi and began teaching Zen in the United States using much the same model that Suzuki Roshi had, where he was teaching Westerners to meditate and things like that. And both Suzuki Roshi and Maezumi Roshi really pushed the envelope when they started to give Buddhist ordination to American students. Suzuki Roshi's students are still going strong, and there are students of Suzuki Roshi and students of Suzuki Roshi's students all over the United States now. And the same is true of Maizumi Roshi. His students spread out all over the United States and began training students of their own as well. And so we see that pretty much all of the Zen communities, with a few exceptions, in the United States have a relationship somehow either to Suzuki Roshi or Maizumi Roshi. Other teachers did come and start teaching in the U.S. eventually. I'm thinking about Sasaku Roshi and Edo Roshi. But really, the most influential Japanese Buddhist teachers in America in the early period were Suzuki Roshi and Maizumi Roshi. In discussing the emergence of Buddhism as a more mainstream spiritual practice, we also need to talk about the influence that Tibetan Buddhism has had on Buddhism in America. Tibetan Buddhism came to America pretty early, as early as the 50s and 60s. That is largely a response to the forced diaspora of Tibetan Buddhism in the 50s when the Chinese invaded Tibet. Following that, sort of forced mass exodus from Tibet after the Chinese invasion, many of the great, spiritual teachers of Tibet moved west. And probably the most famous Tibetan Buddhist to move west was a man named Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Chogyam Trungpa first went to Great Britain and spent some time there. And then he came to the United States, first settling in Vermont, and then eventually moving to Boulder, Colorado. And finally, towards the end of his life, he moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada. Chogyam Trungpa is an important person in the discussion of Buddhism in America. It's, I think, safe to say that anywhere you go, whether it's a Tibetan Buddhist community or a Zen community, even some of the Theravadan communities, everybody knows who Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was, and pretty much every teacher has read at least one of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's books. Now, he wrote many books, but two of them, I would say, are really, really important for understanding how Buddhism has taken root in America and moved into the mainstream. The first is called Shambhala, the Sacred Path of the Warrior. And in that book, he basically takes the core principles of Buddhism and reframes them in secular language and puts them out as a model for an enlightened society. And that book, was published at a time when people were really looking for something to feed them spiritually. And a lot of people found comfort in an ideology or a worldview that presented concepts of awareness and sanity, but did so in secular language. The other book that he is really well known for, and which has had a huge impact on Buddhism in the West, is Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And in this book, he goes after religious institutions and points to the reality that human beings spend way more time focused on doctrine and dogma than on actually developing themselves within the religious traditions to which they lay claim. I mean, of course, he uses that same critique on Buddhism, and he says, that a lot of people get wrapped up in the label of Buddhist and don't spend the time that they need to spend practicing Buddhism. And he says this is true of all religions in the world. And these two books really begin to shape an entire generation of Buddhist practitioners in America. Another thing about Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche that starts to be important, I think, and I will talk more about this when I talk about major challenges facing Buddhism in the 21st century. But Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was associated with a concept called crazy wisdom. And this is an idea in Buddhism that says that there will be, on rare occasion, teachers, enlightened individuals who will appear, and instead of presenting spiritual truths in a way that is aligned with the mainstream point of view, they teach through outrageous behavior. They show up and they challenge everything that you think you know about your own religious tradition. And within some schools of Tibetan Buddhism, it is believed that Chogyam Trungpa was a crazy wisdom teacher. He certainly behaved in outrageous ways and did outrageous things, and many of his students argued that those outrageous behaviors were actually a way of shocking people into a more honest awareness of the human condition. Though his behaviors to many people on the outside seemed to be really inappropriate and problematic. If you're interested in learning more about Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, there's a lot of information out there about him, especially since he lived in Boulder, Colorado, here on the Front Range where I am. His name is, heard commonly. As a Buddhist scholar, I certainly have encountered a lot of his students and a lot of his work. He also founded Naropa University, which is in Boulder, Colorado, which is an accredited university that has both undergraduate and graduate programs. So he really has been an incredibly influential individual in Buddhism and its movement towards mainstream religion in America. I think it's also really important to talk about His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. When the Chinese forced their way into Tibet, the Dalai Lama was forced to flee from Tibet. At that time, he was both the political and the religious leader of Tibet. That is no longer the case. He has renounced his political leadership of Tibet and has turned it over to a democratically elected government in exile. But he has been such a charismatic and energetic voice in the latter half of the 20th century and now moving into the 21st century. And he's really become, in so many ways, the public face of Buddhism. I mean, most people, if you say to them, oh, can you think of anyone who's Buddhist? Many people will immediately say, oh, the Dalai Lama, he's Buddhist. Many people also think that the Dalai Lama functions as sort of a Buddhist pope, which is not actually true. He's very well respected throughout the Buddhist world. I think most Buddhists really respect him and feel that he is an important voice in the Buddhist world, but he doesn't have the authority over Buddhists outside of Tibet that the Pope, has over, like the Pope has influence over Catholics all over the world. The Dalai Lama only has direct influence over Tibetan Buddhists, but certainly Buddhists all over the world really respect and appreciate him. I think that because he's become such a public figure, he's become part of how modern people in America especially, perceive Buddhism. They see his friendliness and his happiness. They see his emphasis on the well-being of others as really being
indicative of what it must be to be a Buddhist. So he's helped to kind of shape the general perception of Buddhism in the West. Sometimes that's accurate, and sometimes it might not be entirely accurate. But certainly he's become sort of the public face of Buddhism. And finally, I just want to mention a much more recent voice and influential player in the Tibetan Buddhist community in America. Pema Chodron is a Buddhist nun. She was a student, actually, of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and she is really a prolific writer. She's written so many books, some of which have been like New York Times bestsellers, I think. Certainly her books are widely read. Many people who are not Buddhist read Pema Chodron's books. She's written things like The Places That Scare You and When Things Fall Apart. Those are just a couple of her books. Pema Chodron has become a real spokesperson for bringing Buddhist meditation practices and Buddhist philosophy out into a more secular environment. Though she herself makes no qualms about being a nun, she always appears in her nun's robes, all of that. She's really interested in just trying to meet people where they are, to talk to people about their lived experiences, their daily lives, and she offers ways in which the Buddhist teachings, whether taken with a lot of religious content or without any religious content, might be helpful for people in the difficulties that they experience. You can find her books pretty much everywhere. You can also find public talks that she's given on YouTube. Really, her name is everywhere. In Buddhist academic circles, we often joke that Pema Chodron is what we call Buddhist famous. So as Buddhism and Hinduism have become more mainstream, we also see that there are many challenges that they face, just like any other religious tradition in the 21st century in America. So the first major challenge that I would identify is the challenge of diversity. Both Hinduism and Buddhism in America really are divided in terms of the populations who practice them. You have Hindu communities who are living in America, immigrant communities. And then you also have communities in America who are practicing Hindu derived or Hindu inspired religious practices like yoga. And within the Hindu reality, shall we call it, you don't see a lot of overlap. In many cases, if you are culturally Hindu, you go to a temple or you practice with other people who are culturally Hindu. Very rarely are these two groups sort of your Western white yoga population and your culturally Hindu population. Very rarely do they practice together, though that is beginning to change in the 21st century. We also see that this is true in Buddhist communities. You'll see communities, for example, that are culturally Tibetan Buddhist, and then you'll see communities that are practicing Tibetan Buddhism, but mainly made up of non-Tibetan practitioners. And oftentimes these two populations practice separately. Some of that actually has to do with language
barrier. The Tibetan populations practice Tibetan Buddhism in Tibetan, and the non-Tibetan populations tend to practice in a mixture of their native language. Of course, in America, mostly that's English, with some practice in Tibetan. But many Tibetan teachers have made an effort not to require their students to learn to speak Tibetan in order to practice Buddhism. Within the Japanese Buddhist communities, at this point, the number of first-generation Japanese Americans is decreasing. So we don't see as much of a division between Japanese American populations practicing Japanese Buddhism and non-Japanese American populations. There's more of a mixture within the Japanese communities. Where we still see the most separation within those communities is probably along the West Coast, where there are still large populations of first generation, and in Hawaii as well. This is also true within the Chinese communities. By and large, in the Chinatowns and places like that still exist, if you go to those temples, whether they're Buddhist or Taoist, you're likely to see populations that are mainly speaking Chinese. So there is a separation between the populations of culturally Chinese practitioners and non-culturally Chinese practitioners. Another diversity issue that faces these traditions in the 21st century is the issue of gender equality. In the Hindu communities, this is, in a lot of ways, getting better, at least in the non-culturally Hindu communities. In culturally Hindu communities, there's still some gender divide, but within the Hindu communities in the United States, that is decreasing quite a bit. And certainly in the non-culturally Hindu populations, you see many women taking roles of leadership. I mean, many yoga teachers are women, and a lot of times, thinking back to when I talked about Amma, one of the Hindu gurus, many of her groups that exist around the U.S. are led by women as well. Finally, I would raise the respect for and awareness of LGBTQ plus identities. This is starting to become a major conversation in many of the populations as well. There's not so much conversation around it in Hindu populations that I'm aware of. Though as we go deeper into the 21st century, that conversation will need to be present in Hindu populations. Largely, Hindu populations don't seem to have quite the same challenges to those identities that we find in the Abrahamic religions. Within the Buddhist communities, one of the big challenges that we're seeing, both in terms of gender equality and in respect and awareness of LGBTQ identities, is that Buddhist teachings so often downplay the reality of individual identity. So in many cases, people with minority identities, I mean, this is also true for people who are not white in white Buddhist communities. A lot of times those minority identities are marginalized and put off to the side, and then if something is said about the mistreatment of minority groups, people will say things like, oh, well, don't you know that there's no such thing as the self? You need to meditate more to deal with your sense of ego, all of this. And now we're starting to really see people within those communities who have been practicing meditation for, it's sometimes even decades, pushing back and saying, no, that is not a reasonable response to the marginalization and mistreatment of minorities. Within many of the Buddhist communities right now in this country, we are seeing a lot of people of color speaking up and speaking out. I'm thinking most especially about Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams and Lama Rod Owens. There's also Zenju Earthland Manuel and Myoke Kane Barrett, just to name a few of the teachers whose voices have really started to come to the forefront. Oftentimes, in my own experience, when I've gone to be with Buddhist communities in the United States, there's not a lot of racial diversity in those populations, and finally people are speaking up and beginning to ask why that is the case. So we are starting to see more awareness within both Hindu and Buddhist communities around questions of diversity. Another issue that's coming up in a major way, this was true in the later half of the 20th century and has continued into the 21st century, is the issue of abuse of power. Most notably, there have been numerous cases of teachers having sexual relationships with their students. This has been true in Hindu communities, yoga communities, as well as Buddhist communities. There have been some documentaries done in recent years about some of what's gone on in the yoga communities. There's a movie called Holy Hell, which is a documentary about a sort of Hindu-inspired religious group called the Buddha Field that existed for about 22 years and in some ways continues to exist. And there's also another documentary about the founder of Bikram Yoga called Bikram Yogi Guru Predator. And both of these films really are looking at abuse of power, sexual and physical and emotional abuse that went on with these teachers. This has become a really serious issue. It's not a new issue within these communities. Some of these situations and stories go back to the 70s. The same is also true in Buddhist communities in the United States. Several of the Zen communities went through revelations about abuse of power, most especially sexual abuse. Really, most of the Zen communities went through that stuff in the 90s and the early 2000s. And now in the last 5 years or so, along with the Me Too movement, some of the Tibetan Buddhist communities have been dealing with many of the same challenges about sexual abuse and abuse of power, centered on the leaders of individual groups as well as senior teachers under those leaders. If you're interested in pursuing any of those stories, there's plenty of information available. And it's going to be an interesting thing to see as both Hindu and yoga communities and Buddhist communities move forward in the 21st century, how they're going to go about addressing these abuses of power, and most especially how they're going to address sexual assault and rape allegations that have gone on within the highest tiers of their religious leadership.
And third, I would identify the New Age movement as a challenge that faces Hinduism and Buddhism in the 21st century. Um, in a lot of ways, the New Age movement is a new wave of Orientalism. And here I would define Orientalism as the behavior that seeks to simultaneously elevate and denigrate Eastern culture. It's a sort of attitude that sees the East as being the repository of mysticism and wisdom and power, but at the same time sees Western culture as being superior in such a way that it can take from Eastern cultures whatever it wants. And this leads to an attitude of what is called cultural appropriation, which is basically picking and choosing things from another religious tradition or culture and using them however you want. And we see this in the New Age movement in the ways in which Eastern traditions have been sort of picked over like a buffet, and people claim to practice certain aspects of Hinduism or certain aspects of Buddhism or even Taoism, but they don't really have any grounding in the philosophy of those cultures and traditions. They don't have any deep awareness of the quite literally centuries of practice and study and development that went into creating the practices that they have sort of cherry-picked. Another part of what comes about as a sort of side effect of this New Age movement is also the view of spirituality as a money-making enterprise. This could tie in to some of what I highlighted in abuse of power, most especially the misuse of financial resources. In the modern world, we see many people offering all kinds of spiritual fix-it, cures kind of things. But you have to take all of these classes and all of these different levels of training, and each level costs more money than the last level, and you need all of these things before you can take this class. And we start to see that sort of the commodification of spirituality in the New Age movement. We can also see some of this New Age mentality in what has been coined as the McMindfulness movement. Mindfulness has become a buzzword in so many circles. We see it used by Google. We see it used in mainstream education. Mindfulness has become a sort of ubiquitous term. And mindfulness really is rooted in some of the early Buddhist teachings about basic meditation practices of shamatha and vipassana. The difficulty in the way in which mindfulness is being presented in the 21st century is that it is a disciplining of the mind that has been divorced from training the mind in ethics. Certainly what we find in early Buddhism is that, yes, training the mind is very important, but alongside developing discipline or focus, a person also needs to develop ethics. The best analogy I can give is, in applying mindfulness, you teach a person to be more focused and more disciplined. If you teach a CEO who is already ruthless and cruel to be mindful, they just become more effectively ruthless and cruel. They don't, by virtue of training their mind, become kinder or more compassionate. That's where those ethical teachings come in. And much of what's been used
in the mindfulness movement is actually being used to teach people how to be more focused at work, more complacent, less stressed, so that they can, in effect, be more productive workers. There's really no interest in the actual intention of how the mindfulness teachings were delivered in early Buddhism, which was to help people escape from suffering and to develop compassion and kindness for other beings. And finally, I would identify that Hinduism and Buddhism have been morphed in the New Age movement into a sort of a pseudo-psychology, something that attempts to explain the world through a combination of poorly understood science and poorly understood psychology and poorly understood mysticism as well. We see that meditation, especially as it's connected with sort of the mindfulness movement, is viewed as being a panacea rather than a tool to help people more actively engage with the world as it is. Instead, Hinduism and Buddhism and the practices associated with them have become a sort of misunderstood practice whereby people think they can escape from the world, which neither Hinduism nor Buddhism advocate for. Both Hinduism and Buddhism say that the way to deal with the suffering of the world is to be fully present in the world and to develop compassion. But what we see in a lot of misrepresentations in the New Age movement is that Hindu and Buddhist practices are a way to escape from the world, to escape from the pain of reality, rather than turning to face it head on.
Well, on behalf of Reverend Thomas Tizosh and myself, Patrick De Silva, I want to thank you for listening to this extended presentation, Putting Down New Roots, Major Religious Traditions in America. I also wanted to comment on things that we didn't cover in this presentation. We did not cover any indigenous religious traditions, and that's very much, on purpose. They deserve their own dedicated presentation, which we hope to bring to you perhaps in 2021. And our emphasis for today's presentation was really looking at these groups that have been brought to these traditions that have been brought to the U.S. Thank you for listening, and we hope that it is useful, and I encourage you to look at all of the resources we provided on the various further reading pages. There's a wonderful amount of scholarship on religion in America. It sort of forms its own distinct discipline within the Academy of Religious Studies, and we're just hoping to provide you with a springboard to explore the specific topics that are of most interest to you. Thank you so much.